Welcome to Vienna Up Conference. I'm Mariana Bonecchi, Managing Partner of AV Ventures and a Senior Advisor to the Austrian business agency in Silicon Valley. Today, we'll be talking about the culture of failure. Failures happen to founders of small businesses. They happened also at large, sophisticated corporations. But as Steve Blank famously said, it's not fine to fail, it's terrible. But if you are afraid to fail, you will never succeed. We have incredible speaker joining us today. We'll have 3 panels and later we'll open the room for Q&A. I'm so thrilled to welcome Chris Messina. Chris has designed products and experiences for Google and Uber. He founded startups, created movements, and acted as a catalyst for change in small and large organizations. And of course, Chris is very well known for one thing every one of you uses daily, the hashtag. Welcome, Chris. We are so thrilled you can join us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to this conversation.
Chris, the hashtag had such a profound impact on the world. More than 200 people use hashtag every day on Twitter alone. Some people, I would say even younger audiences do not even know the world without hashtag ever existed. Take us back to the time when you had this idea.
Yeah, I mean, just a slight modification. I think last I checked, it was like 200 million was used just on Twitter, and that was like 2017. So it's blown up since then, I guess. But it's been what? When I came out with this idea, this was 2007. So it's been almost 15 years. And social media was very different back then. I think our hopes and dreams and ambitions for what social media would become was a little bit different. And I would say in general, what we found ourselves in was sort of maybe this pivot or migration from desktop computing experiences to ones that were mobile. And once the mobile phone became much more prominent, the ways in which you could use digital technology for social interactions became a lot more obvious. And I think especially just given the age and demographic of the folks who were building these platforms back then, we were, wanting to go out with their friends. We were wanting to use these technologies to communicate, to connect, to find each other. And so what we found was that, I guess the tooling was just sort of a blunt force instrument, and we had to co-modify it while modifying the technology as well as modifying our own behavior to adapt and to adjust to these things. And so the hashtag kind of came out of that. I'm happy to go into more details about that, but that sort of, I guess, gives you a little bit of a sense for where things were back then.
I was just curious, what was the moment that you realized that hashtag became viral?
Well, the hashtag kind of like builds off of a set of either innovations or behavioral changes or just sort of like adaptations in the marketplace. When the hashtag was first proposed, maybe there was a couple thousand people who were using Twitter. So it was a very small number of people. And there was a great deal of skepticism that Twitter would ever become anything that would be relevant for anybody outside of Silicon Valley. It was, I would say, quite esoteric and strange. So a lot of us who were using it were also esoteric and strange. And so it had to go through a series of, I guess, what happened was Instagram sort of came out in 2009 or 10 after the iPhone had sort of, I think, become a success. And it was really Instagram that I think brought hashtag into like the mainstream consciousness, because back before we had computer vision, when you searched for content on Instagram, you couldn't find anything unless people added keywords. And because we'd already been using these tags on Twitter, and Twitter was sort of an established space, and of course, a lot of people from Twitter migrated over to Instagram for their photo sharing, the habit and practice of tagging content with hashtags kind of migrated naturally. And I would say up until 2011 or 12, Twitter was vehemently opposed and hated the hashtag. So it was Instagram and the competition from Instagram that led Twitter, I think, to the recognition that, oh my God, this is actually very important and powerful. And in fact, we can monetize it. And so, yeah, it was probably, I mean, it was Instagram. But the moment where I realized that the hashtag itself was going to be fine, I guess, and maybe adopted more broadly was I was traveling around in some rural part of California. And this was around the time of the Tea Party and the financial crisis, so 2008. And I saw in the middle of some field a big poster for the Tea Party, the political party, using a hashtag. And I was like, oh my God, like this is like way outside of Silicon Valley, way outside of San Francisco, and it's being used for a political purpose. So there was a recognition and a realization that social media was going to be powerful and important in politics, which of course now we've learned has been very powerful. But that was the first moment where I really saw the adoption of social media by people outside of, I would say, the tech world.
Let's just double click on Twitter. So it's actually hard to believe that Twitter initially rejected the whole idea of hashtag, and they told you the things were for nerds and they will never catch on. I was just thinking at this moment, many people would have given up, but not you. So I'm curious to learn about how you develop this mindset that helped you to persevere in the face of rejection.
Some of it is just like stupidity, and some of it is just kind of not knowing any better. I think in this case, the thing that was really different, and I think an important part of maybe the cultural zeitgeist back then, was the degree to which there was this kind of bi-directional conversational relationship between people who are building the technology and people who are using it. And so the fact that we were in conversation about these things made it seem like these social platforms and products were ours, that they were being built with us, not just at us. And so what I mean by that is, like the day after I wrote a blog post that described how I thought the hashtag could be used and could work, and it was 2,000 words, and I had mock-ups and screenshots and everything like that, I was putting this out there for the community to take. It was sort of a community focused proposal. And when I brought it into Twitter's headquarters, because I could literally walk in the front door because there was no security, and I walked up to Biz Stone, who was one of the co-founders, and I tried to propose my idea to him. I was just like kind of a snot-nosed kid. Like, he didn't know me for anyone else. He had recently, they'd sold their company Blogger to Google. So, they were a lot more experienced than I was. And so I proposed this idea, and he just kind of dismissed it out of hand because, of course, Twitter servers were like on fire. It was like they were blowing up in terms of popularity. And so taking time to listen to one more user's idea, I think was just something that, I don't know, I've been on those product teams. Like, lots of people have lots of ideas to solve very, very specific niche problem. And so the rejection didn't feel personal per se. It just felt like, okay, either he doesn't get it or he wants to solve this from a different perspective. And because they'd sold their company to Google, I think they saw the world as being able to be organized and made sense of through just algorithms and through computers. And asking users to change their behavior was a really, really tall order, and rarely succeeded or worked. Now, I had the benefit of, one, being very much embedded in part of that early social media community. And I happen to have lots of friends who are building apps for the Twitter platform. And I think that's another lesson in that early Twitter. And it's interesting to sort of see some parallels in, for example, products like Clubhouse now were focused on building kind of like the core fundamental aspects of the service. And then they had APIs that allowed other people to build on top of or to extend the utility of the core service. And so because I knew a lot of the people who were building apps for Twitter back then, all I had to do was kind of go and convince them to add support for the hashtag. And what then ended up happening was over years, Twitter started to acquire those companies, and rather than remove the code and remove the feature of the support for the hashtag, they just kind of left it in. And so it was sort of a Trojan horse way of getting it into the company. But I guess I wasn't deterred because, first of all, it was totally within my power, I guess, to try this thing out and see if it would work. I had lots of other ideas. There was an idea that I had actually before the hashtag that was called whispering tweets. And the idea was, and it's sort of unintuitive, you'd put an exclamation point in front of your whole tweet, and then it would not get broadcast out to all of your followers. And the reason for that was because back then in 2006 and 2007, anytime you tweeted, it would get pushed as a text message to all of your followers. So sometimes you want to just say some stupid whatever nonsense, neuroplasticity will save us all. And you don't want to actually like tell the whole world, but you kind of want it on your profile. So this was a way of trying to limit the spread of information while still being able to publish through that channel. And then the next blog post that I wrote was about the hashtag. So one idea clearly didn't take off and the other one did. So it was sort of just a multiplicity of different ideas and thoughts about how the service could be improved through modifying, in that case, some text.
Oh, I love this story. Wow. So, I was just reading somewhere that you live in Silicon Valley for over 15 years at this technology edge. And as you mentioned before, so you were in the social media community early on. So I was just like wondering, what is the culture of failure here in Silicon Valley? And how do you think it differs from the other parts of United States or other regions in the world?
Yeah, I remember pretty distinctly, there was a time when I was in Paris. I think maybe it was 2000, I'm going to say between 2007 and 9, let's say. And I was on a panel with Mike Arrington from TechCrunch. And I think he thought I was, he didn't take me very seriously, which story of my life, like it's reasonable and probably appropriate. But we were on this panel and there was a question that said, will Paris ever be able to, have its own version of Silicon Valley? And I feel like this is the story that's been out there, or a question that many places have been asking themselves for the last decade easily, because they look at the success of Silicon Valley and they want to copy or at least achieve the same economic outcomes that Silicon Valley has. But I've seen efforts to repeat or kind of replicate what goes on here, and there seems to be like a fundamental misunderstanding of why Silicon Valley works the way it does, and how it has this sort of brilliant combination of kind of academia, military contracts, weird counterculture revolutionaries, strange people, third wave coffee, as well as just, and also like open source. And when I came out to Silicon Valley in 2004, I was involved in the open source community, in the open source movement. One of my first projects was to launch Firefox, and I think that what seems to be a little bit different is the nature of competition and the nature of what we're all, at least in that era, it's changed a little bit since then, was about what we were trying to build for and towards. There was a real desire, I think, to build for the future and to then help one another and to share the learnings as we went, rather than sort of being calcified or, I don't know, kind of convinced that we were right about anything. There was this constant kind of one-upmanship around building better and faster and more interesting, and trying to whittle away at the way in which technology limited our ability to communicate or to connect, or that we had to sort of minimize the way that we presented information or art to the limits of what technology afforded us. And so that constant willingness to tear down and rebuild is a big part of, I think, the culture here, where it's just assumed. One of the ways in which I've seen this play out, and we'll sort of circle back around to what you're asking, during my time at Google, one of the things that really stood out to me was how much Google, in a way, rewrites the internal code, like literally its code, like every year. It sort of goes through this shedding of old code and ideas. Like engineers are so thrilled when they can delete code. And it's because they're moving forward, and there's not a kind of nostalgia for the way things were and the way things that have been. There's a desire to keep iterating and keep moving and keep trying things. I think although Zuckerberg gets dinged for this a lot, the idea of moving fast and breaking things was more an attitude of not writing code that is so perfect and so perfect that you couldn't feel the desire to overwrite it with something better. And that if you needed to break things along the way, in other words, features that wouldn't work, or granted the whole privacy thing is a little bit challenging, but at the very least, you could write things, and if it broke someone else's code, it was acceptable, as opposed to something that would get you fired. And that dynamic and the way in which conflict was resolved when those interactions would occur was, I think, very, very different than you'd expect in other places, where there's a lot more territoriality or a desire to say, no, this is my code and this is my project, and you go do your thing over there. There's a lot more, I don't know, it's like full contact kind of product design and development. And then a real willingness to talk to users, to go out there and to learn about what, mistakes you've made. And so that, again, going back to like my experience with the hashtag, I think also should inform the way that people approach doing product design today, which is to be in constant conversation with people. And if you have a healthy conversation with the people that you're serving, then products become artifacts of those healthy conversations, as opposed to the end unto itself. In other words, back in the days when we would build software, let's say, and publish it on CD-ROMs and had them sent out, you'd have to do a lot of testing. You have to make sure that like whatever is put on the CD, works, it doesn't crash computers and so on. And so it was a very slow but rigorous process because the failure case was so much more expensive. But in the era of the internet, you can literally push something out in the morning, realize that it, is breaking a bunch of things, tweet about, how you've realized that you put the bad code out there, you're working on a fix, and then by the end of the day, it's rolled out and it's fixed. And that previously, that cycle would have taken 6 months. So it's just a different attitude about how to move and to build and to design and to deploy.
Right. So, if I read through your resume, I also see like the invention seems to be at the core of your career. You have created so many movements. You started the first or co-organized the first bar camp, and then you popularized the unconference event format. And you actually started the very first co-working space in the world. I would like to learn, what do you attribute your ability to generate these ideas that catch on fire?
Well, I mean, I want to be clear in that there were a bunch of people who worked on a lot of these original ideas. I think that I helped to catalyze some of these movements because of the way that I approached, I guess, what I would think of as success. And by that, what I mean is, again, coming out of the open source tradition in 2004 and 5, I kind of approached a lot of the things that I worked on in a very similar way. So I took a lot of the ideas of open source and of kind of open ownership and contribution as part and parcel to these other initiatives that I engaged in. So for example, in 2005 with Barcamp was essentially it became decentralized, but it was an event model where the participants who attended determined the sessions that would be given. And this is also known as an unconference or open space model. And Tim O'Reilly, who's a well-known publisher, would have these kind of ritualistic gatherings in Sebastopol where the O'Reilly headquarters were based, and would bring a lot of people that he wanted to write books for him. And, sort of a lot of like, Larry and Sergey and a bunch of those folks would go to these events, and they were very well known. And in 2005, of course, I wasn't invited because I wasn't anybody. And so because Tim O'Reilly was such an advocate for open source, I thought, well, why don't I just take his event model and we'll popularize it and sort of run our own, and we'll have 20 of our friends show up, and it'll be a good time, and we'll drink some beer, and it'll be good. And what ended up happening instead was we organized our event in a matter of 6 days. We used wikis, we used IRC, we used a bunch of kind of early days social tools, and ended up having 300 people show up. And the conference organized itself very much in the way that the internet does. And it was incredible. We launched a number of platforms and products that are well known today. One of them was, of course, TechCrunch. Another was Pandora. Matt Mullenweg from WordPress was there. Like, we had a lot of really interesting people that became quite influential in the tech world because, again, of that spirit of coming together to build together, to share our knowledge and what we were seeing in this kind of new paradigm. And from there, I had a bunch of people reach out to me who wanted me to come and organize bar camps for them. And so what I did instead was I designed a logo for them with their city or state or country and their flag. And I gave them logo, and I said, no, this is an open source event. You have to build it yourself. And so because we had documented everything openly and publicly, and we were receiving, we were on a mailing list, people started to run these events themselves, and they started to realize that they didn't need to get permission from a central authority. They could actually serve themselves. And I suppose just since everything had been done in a way in which a commercial outcome and commercial success was the goal, this was a pretty novel thing to do. And instead, because I wasn't interested in a commercial outcome, I wasn't interested in making money, I was interested in helping to propagate our culture and to enfranchise people who previously felt like they had to go to these big events, in big cities. I was like, the internet allows us to organize wherever we are in the world. And so giving people permission to think of things differently was, I think, a big part of that project. And so in 2006, after the Barcamp community had started to get going, and it started to pop up kind of all over the place, I and some friends realized that we kind of wanted to have the Barcamp experience of coming together with lots of different people and groups on a daily basis. And to do that, we needed a permanent space. And so a friend of mine named Brad Newberg had been doing something that he called co-working. And he was doing it on let's say twice, I think every other week, in the Mission in San Francisco. And I was like, I really think that what you're doing is super important, but we should be doing this every day. And with that, decided with a couple friends to start up the first co-working space, the first dedicated co-working space in Dogpatch in San Francisco. And then after we sort of ran that into the ground because we were kind of communist about charging people and not very well organized, that was a really good failure, actually. We ended up starting another space that was called Citizen Space, and that was in South Park in San Francisco. And that sort of blossomed into a much larger community, which again, we ended up publishing all of our finances. We published everything that we did to organize the space. We put everything out there as though it was an open source project. And we invited other people to not franchise our model, but just take it, run with it, and innovate on it. And so I think that taking that approach in the early days when the internet was starting to get out there and really focusing more on the social aspects of integrating those communities together helped find success for those initiatives.
So interesting. Like what I hear, it's like your constant wish to start something new, to change something. It's really amazing. So I think like part of it is probably this growth mindset that is such a driving force behind any innovation. And yet some cultures are still very much focused on perfectionism. How one can learn to think differently?
Well, I mean, I myself suffer from some perfectionism as well, so I definitely can relate. I think in some ways, there's freedom in being strong enough in yourself to acknowledge the things that you don't know, and to then go about discovering like the truth of something in concert with other people. In other words, I didn't know how to run an event. I'd never run an event before. I didn't know how to deal with like the logistics, and we probably didn't even have insurance back then. Like all these things that you kind of need to do if you're really aware of the risks and the ways in which you can get dinged, and all the things that have been put in place in some ways, like to protect people from people who are either not thoughtful or are trying to do something for the purpose of exploitation or commercial gain. I think because I and many of my friends were coming at this from a desire of serving one another and of just trying things. I suppose it wasn't so much that we were like, oh, I need a growth mindset. It was just that we were in this sort of process of growth, and the mindset kind of derived from whatever came our way that we didn't know how to do or didn't know how to understand. Like I remember there was one hackathon that I went to where like the internet wasn't working. And actually one of the things, at the first bar camp, I remember now, so the internet connectivity was so bad because we were in a building in Palo Alto that hadn't been wired yet. And we ended up getting someone to beam us microwave Wi-Fi from like 60 miles away or something in order to like light up the venue and to provide Wi-Fi. That had never been done before. We didn't know how to do it. And somebody was like, oh, I can do this. And like, they were like this crazy, weird sort of war driving like hacker. And they just went and did it. So I suppose maybe the growth mindset is also kind of related to the hacker mindset. And it's like, if you kind of just keep going and focus on the goal or the outcome that you want to achieve, then again, getting stuck in the mud of current solutions, just kind of, you become very sensitive and almost like triggered by it. And so you're like, no, we're getting like bogged down here in like BS and details that are not actually going to serve the ultimate goal or outcome that we're trying to achieve. So let's pause this for now and let's try some other things. So maybe that also comes from dexterity with technology and overcoming any fears of it and realizing that we built these things, humans built these things. And so therefore we are also empowered to modify it and to change it. I mean, it comes down to, I think, again, understanding your risk model and what's at stake. I think there are a lot of people whose job it is to be completely risk averse and to make sure that nothing bad ever happens. If you're running like a nuclear power plant, moving fast and breaking things is probably not the MO that you want to adopt. At the same time, we're also running towards this climate crisis that does require a different way of thinking, and to examine the systems and structures that are in place, how they got to be in place, and whether the intention of the people who put them in place was for those things to exist as institutions indefinitely. Just because they exist and have persisted for some period of time doesn't necessarily mean that you can't ask, I think, questions of the intentions of the people who put them there, and whether or not they can be evolved from the current, like from the place in which you found them.
Very interesting. Chris, you are also #1 product hunter. So I'm just curious to hear what products excite you most these days.
Uh, yeah, so product hunt is, I think of it as like the Olympics of products on the internet. Um, every day there's a 24-hour leaderboard, and what that means is that any products that are found by members of the community, i.e. hunters, so like myself, are posted, and then the community votes and comments on them to determine who comes out at the top of this kind of like all-out brawl. And I think it's fun, it's exciting, it's really a way for me to kind of surf the future and to see what problems people want to work on and what problems they're feeling themselves, because product hunt submissions kind of run the gamut from apps and little hacks that people built for themselves to full-fledged, fully funded startups. And what that allows me to do is to see the dynamism and the range in what current and new and emerging technologies are allowing people to build for. One of the things that's been very interesting, of course, in the last year has been the number of apps that use video as a core medium and are evolving that format in a way that, web pages or like bots, for example, in 2016 was a huge trend because we were starting to see that conversational AI might be possible. Obviously, we're sort of in the trough of despair and maybe we're sort of on the way up with bots, but relative to that, I would say we're in the early innings of video simply because the bandwidth hasn't been there, the compute power hasn't been there, the machine learning models for working with video and compression and all that stuff has really just started to become socialized in a way that allows people to build. So I would say that those are very interesting. In addition or adjacent to that, I would say virtual presence. Obviously a lot of us spend many days just, kind of in these square rectangles in Zoom, but a lot of people are bringing the elements of kind of MMORPGs and gaming into these spaces where people can move about and kind of interact with each other in a spatial environment. And I think that there's some really interesting elements that are being brought into that to kind of bring together elements of the metaverse with collaboration, communication, and just being kind of very online.
So are there any apps from Austria that caught your attention?
That's the funny thing. Product Hunt is such a global and diverse place that the like where someone comes from hasn't really stood out. So I wish I had an answer that could say, oh, like this app or this app, but I can't
you
bring
probably
up
know
any.
Remove Background. Have you
Oh,
ever heard?
yeah, of
There
course.
you go.
Well, then there you go. Fabulous.
All right, Chris. So where can listeners go and learn more about what you're doing and how you help founders building their products?
Yeah, well, I've got a website, chrismessina.me. That's a great place to go. And of course, I'm also very active on Twitter. My username is Chris Messina, so you can follow me there and get a lot of snark and also just stuff that I'm seeing about the tech world. So those are the two places I would go.
Excellent. Are there any parting thoughts you would like to share with us?
Well, I mean, I really appreciate being invited to this conversation. Vienna is one place that I would love to go someday. I have not gotten there yet. And I think just in general, one of the things that is really important to put a lot of this into context is thinking into the future and thinking about the type of work that especially young people are going to be engaged in. And to the degree to which being very dynamic in the way that you, I think, understand and perceive yourself and how you can change yourself in order to adapt and to respond to the continued evolution of technology. We are still in the very, very early innings of artificial intelligence and how that's going to change work. And if you go into that space, imagining yourself to be one thing and only one thing, that's a pretty brittle, I think, perspective to come from. So failure is going to be not only like necessary, but that is the way that we learn. Machine learning works by having reinforcement mechanisms and loops and rewards that reward successes, but that requires there to be millions and millions of failures to get to those positive outcomes. So what I guess I've learned out of Silicon Valley, being here for so long, is that it's really, as they say, more shots on goal that leads to better outcomes. Or it's more, doing the reps, for example. And so you may have thousands and thousands of failures, but the few successes you do have are going to be so much stronger and come from such a place of knowing, and you'll be able to explain what it was that didn't work, that I think is a necessary part of the learning process and the learning engine that is this sort of co-evolution of technology, culture, and society.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your insights and perspective with us.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Please join us for Q&A later on.
Will do.
Thanks. So for our next panel, I would like to welcome Trevor Hubbard and Michaela Laussegger. Trevor Hubbard is the CEO and executive director of Butchershop, a creative brand consultancy that helps leaders at startups to Fortune 500 companies to evolve, grow, launch, or create businesses. And joining us from Austria is Michaela Laussegger. She is director of Americas at the Austrian Business Agency, the national investment promotion agency of Republic of Austria.
Hi, hello. Welcome to our panel. Really interesting. Thank you, Chris. And welcome, Trevor. Thank you for joining us today. Really a pleasure to talk to you again today. But first of all, I need to excuse a panel member. For this panel, we also thought to or plan to include Linda Kirchberger, the head of new technology of OMB. One of the largest Austrian listed industrial companies, and she would have loved to tell the corporate side of failure and her experiences, but unfortunately she is sick today and can't join us. So we're gonna have a lively discussion with Trevor. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So over the last 20 years, as Mariana mentioned, Butchershop, you and your team have been working in the field of brand in the Silicon Valley. And what is your impression of the culture of failure in this sphere that you're working at currently?
Yeah, first of all, Chris was great. I subscribe to a lot of the things that he says, and I always love hearing people's origin stories. So well done. That was cool to hear. I think the pressure of failure is always a wonderful thing. I think that's what drives a lot of innovation. It always has, and failure is extremely valuable. The problem is that you're always one step away from success after a failure, but most people stop at failures, right? And they don't keep going. I think the failure mindset in Silicon Valley right now is more sort of like what Chris was talking about. I think there's this foot on the neck, right? To make failure part of everything you do and make it completely acceptable and making it one of the things that's a key ingredient to either great cultures or entrepreneurialism or, the way that people use hypothesis thinking or horizon thinking to develop the next, successful thing, right? Something that's useful, something that's meaningful. So failure is a key ingredient, but I think we've over-rotated here in Silicon Valley to think that failure is just one, inevitable, two, it's a necessary ingredient, and three, there's nothing really you can do about it except keep going. And I think that's somewhat misleading. It's a little bit sort of like you're not in control of your own fate. There's nothing you can really do about it. And just, get ready because you're going to fail, and I like to think of it a little bit differently. And one of the things that I see is that the emphasis is put too much on success, right? Most people, founders, startups, and the 30 plus unicorns, I guess, if you want to use that cliche, that we've worked with over the years here in Silicon Valley and in Europe, the emphasis always starts a project where we're going to evolve, build something new or create something new, or grow a brand with this idea of what does success look like, right? And if you focus on that, every company we've ever worked with, that list looks very similar, right? It's about scaling, it's about growth, it's about customer acquisition, it's about product. Success is like a very narrow list. What I love to do and what we've been doing here at Butchershop, and we've been spreading, I guess you could call it the gospel of our perspective and our POV, is to ask the question, what would make this fail? And instead of saying what would make it successful, when you say what would make this fail, you get the unpopular thinking, you get the unsexy things that come out, and you get individual perspectives, especially in teams and groups and product teams and et cetera. And if you're a founder or a CEO and you ask that question, what would make us fail? You get to hear from people a little bit differently, and everybody gets to put this quote unquote rats on the table, or 80% of the room does zero talking while 20% thinks they're just communicating the plan, right? And so if you ask the failure question, what you're really signaling is that you value clarity above everything else, right? And lack of clarity on any endeavor breeds drama. And so what we try to do is change that mindset to this failure mindset of let's always start with the question of what would make something fail. And I think that's the progression where, people that are high performing, companies or founders or they probably already have that in their mind and their genetic makeup anyway. But for other people, it's a rewiring. And I think that's sort of the difference in the mindset of either Europe or the doc market or Silicon Valley and the US, et cetera. So that's kind of where I put the two goalposts, right, of this success against failure, and then really coming from the side of failure to use it to your advantage. And I'll pause there, but my hypothesis is that you can actually beat failure and get so far out in front of it that you prevent some of the inevitable things from happening, is kind of how I look at it.
Sounds good to me. Last fall I've been listening to your co-worker Nina. She had a presentation in Graz and telling us about the Clarity project. For me, it was really sort of mind opener to start the process from the failure, because I've been sitting in strategy meetings forever, and we always started at the success line. But really for me, it got me started thinking, actually, that's a good one. So from our conversations prior, you're currently working on both sides of the pond. Your company is seeing a growing demand also here in Europe. Can you see there a difference in fear of failure in the corporates that you're working with, for example, here on the European market?
Yeah, I can, but in no way is it one's good or one's bad or anything like that. I think it's more just, maybe I'll just kind of like postulate on what I see as maybe the differences and where I think they derive from. But it is nice to understand people. I think at the end of the day, we hold on to our differences as part of our identity, and I think that is always a wonderful thing. What I see is where are the perspectives coming from, what's motivating them, and what's keeping people locked into their point of view, right? And in Silicon Valley, I think I don't speak for all of Silicon Valley. I'm just been here for 20 years trying to help startups reach the next step of what they're trying to do. But one thing I have noticed is that you got to follow the money, you got to follow the funding, and I think that's a huge motivator for how people think about things, right? And what I've noticed of my last kind of like 7 years of being in Europe and working in specifically Germany, Austria, and Switzerland is the difference in how capital is deployed and how funds are raised and what people are actually funding, right? In the US, in San Francisco, people will fund ideas. They will fund hypothesis. They will fund a horizon strategy where it's like, we haven't proven anything yet, but that's a really good idea. And they will deploy so much money, right, that you sort of have unlimited constraints, right? You're now just sort of trying to jump from one hypothesis to the next, and you're looking for a high velocity sort of growth company that's either marketplace or a SaaS, like you're just trying to figure it out, whether it's enterprise or consumer. And so that pre-product idea that you can pretty much raise millions and millions of dollars without a product is something that I think is starkly unique to the US, right? Whereas in Europe, what I've noticed is that founders have to go build something first. They have to show revenue, right? Or they have to prove it. And then they can get some sort of funding based on that, right? And because Europe is so regionalized, right? A lot of products are sort of built in an interesting way where is the end goal to get to the US, or is it just for the European market? Is it only for one country? So a lot of these technologies, especially that are in HR tech and other things like that, they don't scale because the laws and the rules are so different around things, right? So it's a dance there. But if you follow the money, I think that's where the failure mindset comes in, where Europe is all about success, right? Because they're not funding you unless you show that you're successful, right? Whereas in the US, they're funding things because I believe in that person. You don't have a product yet, but I think you can do it. I'll take that bet. That's different. So the idea that maybe Silicon Valley is more bent on this idea that failing's okay and that there's risk, whereas Europe is about, you better make it work, show me that it works, and maybe I'll write you a check for 500K or whatever. It then gets indoctrinated. And I think that that's not coming from the outside in. I think it's really probably more systemic and more sort of like cultural than it is. And I think that's fascinating, right? I do, however, think things are starting to change. I do think like Silicon Valley venture companies are starting offices and hubs in different, cities around the world. And I think that's really smart. Instead of keeping them separate, they're looking at this cross-pollination of the global economy sort of as their deal flow. And that's wonderful, because I think globalization and universal, like, we're all sharing certain things at this point, right? Whether it's technologies or philosophies or business kind of models. So I think that's the difference. If I think of why I think failure mindset is controversial, maybe in Europe versus what is more readily available and accessible in Silicon Valley.
Cool point. I've heard it before. As you mentioned before, you and your team at Butchershop, you operate from the belief that failure stems from lack of clarity, and therefore you founded the Clarity Project. Please tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, I mean, it just, you have to work on yourself to have a breakthrough, I think. And I can tell you, like, in Butchershop's storied history, the company's been around for 13 years. We also have our own inflection points as a business and as a company. And one of the things that we were doing was this bad habit of just talking about success, what's going to make us successful. And it wasn't until, I think, probably 3.5, 4 years ago that we put the microscope on ourselves, and a guy named Jeremiah asked the stark question to us and said, what would make your company fail? I was like, what? And it was one of those things that I latched onto because it was profound. It hurt my brain, right? It made me think about things that I didn't even know I was thinking, really, or that I didn't want to popularize. It allowed other people to voice their opinions, right, within our company. And it was so powerful, and was probably the reason we have done 100 things since in our business that are bets that are paying off, that are, changing the way we do things profoundly. And so we saw that as wait, if this worked for us, and we're humans, we share a lot of the same sort of problems and risks and appetites for failure and successes, that we sort of put it away for a while and said, other people need this too. And, for developers and engineers, doing a pre-mortem is what we call it, is normal. It's something that probably, can be traced back to somebody at Harvard, right? Coming up with this methodology and organizational design. But we saw a real opportunity to just basically go all in on this failure mindset. And so we created the Clarity Project. And the Clarity Project is one part mindset, philosophy, one part workshop, another part, speaking engagements, spreading the gospel, publishing, things of that nature. But one of the things that we do is create tools. And one of those tools that we created was a digitized version of the pre-mortem process, right? A way that you can virtually start to get into a strategy board and actually ask a group of people the failure question. What would make whatever it is that we're doing, our business, our strategy, our product, what would make that fail? And the product we created was called Prio, PRIIO.com. And it's the first time that you can have this failure mindset as an active tool that you can deploy as many pre-mortems as you want on a myriad of topics. And before we built the product, we were using the pre-mortem process and Prio on every project, with every client, right? And it changed our relationship. It increased what we were able to charge for scopes of work. It allowed clients to be held accountable. It beat failures across the board on many, many different things. And our clients wanted it. They needed to use it themselves. And so we said, okay, let's give it to the world. So we spent about a year building the product. And so the Clarity Project is sort of the overarching umbrella. That's the way we get to talk like this with people. And then, you know, Prio is our first product that's really meant to kind of beat failure, that we just launched. So, yeah.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about how does a pre-mortem workshop work like? Can you
Sure.
maybe within a corporate example? You don't need to mention any names.
Yeah, no, I mean we've done you know pre-mortems with everybody from Databricks to App Dynamics, you know, to Exabeam to Uber, you know, like this is like a normal thing. So I'll tell you kind of how it works, and maybe you can latch on. I even did it on myself as a father. I wanted to know what would make me fail as a father, so I did it on myself. That's maybe too personal, but whatever.
Cool example.
The way that the Prio app works, because it's best just to talk about the app because it is the pre-mortem process. Yeah. So you're able as a facilitator to invite your team, right? 5, 6, 7, 8 people to a Prio session, right? And what happens there is you're prompted to give your question. What would make whatever you're doing fail? Yeah. And then you invite the team to basically in 5 minutes, write as many things down from either their personal team or the company or market perspective of what would make whatever it is that you're doing fail. So they have all their reasons, right? Those get sorted into categories. And then the group goes into a debate on ranking them. So the point is to get a prioritization. Most people focus on the wrong things. Like a company thinks that they're not growing because their website sucks. But if you actually do a pre-mortem, you might realize that you don't really know your audience, or, you know, and so it forces you to kind of look at different things. And so when you rank them, you're able to score them and have a debate with the team on the likelihood of that thing happening, and then the catastrophic impact it would have if it did happen, right? And the system is created so that it will total that all up. It will multiply those numbers, and it will give you your prioritization list from the things that are really big that people thought had a high likelihood and a big catastrophic impact to maybe the things that you don't need to really focus on, right? So instantly what you get is this thing that, oh man, we were focusing on the wrong things, or, oh, we were doing the easy stuff. No one, or, you know, whatever. But the next step is you can then assign accountability. I think you can have 16 meetings on a topic of strategy, or you could have one Prio, you know, in an hour and a half and save all that time. Because you can assign accountability of individuals, and then you can list out the things that are dependencies, follow-up questions, next steps. And so it literally gives you your dashboard forward, right, of how to move forward with the failures in mind. And then it's everyone's responsibility to prevent those things from happening. We've seen it where we can actually use these Prios as a way for our employees to say, how many failures did you prevent in a year? That's pretty cool, right? Rather than, did you do your job and your responsibilities, right? So it's a very active way of engaging and moving forward on a strategy or a product or a company or a business plan or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And it's kind of like in your pocket. You can do it, you know, at an airport. It's not something that you need to have these big, you know, boardroom meetings on, you know? So yeah, that's how you do it.
Cool. Yeah, I suggested that in our office. I haven't gotten the feedback yet. Another story. Burn and crash is one thing, but how do you go about the small everyday shortcomings? How do you deal with them when you have the feeling you can't deliver the 100% or 120% that you would like to deliver on this at this special moment? How do you go about that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it ever stops. Meaning, okay, there's always going to be little things, right? That's just the nature of our world. Yeah. I think my thing is we don't want to have any major breakdowns. The little things I think you can survive with, live with, and they happen. But I do think that like a great culture in a company is really not measured on you know, we always joke kale chips and comfy ergonomic chairs and, you know, paid time off policies and you know, group happy hours. That's not culture. Culture is, to me, what is the level of clarity within the organization from the top to the bottom? If it's high, that's a great culture. If it's low, not so good, right? So if you're really standing for great culture in a company, then you need to put the emphasis on clarity. The problem is that I think clarity is like brand. Clarity is one of the most often misunderstood, misused, overemphasized, buzzwords like collaboration, right? What does it even mean? So when you talk about clarity, I think if that's a premium for you, or you want to be on that path to clarity, it's not about overly communicating or saying the same thing 20 times to make sure it's clear. That's not it. Clarity comes from examining, what would make whatever we're doing fail, and giving everybody that opportunity to be able to contribute to preventing those things from happening. To me, if that is a practice in a company or a business or a product, if that happens, you'll start to see this compression of like little moments that irk you or that are annoying, right? Because everything becomes fun. Everything becomes, we're doing this because we're trying to prevent this from happening. It's really the most interesting way to get on the same page, and you start to see that over time. Is our company, like as we do this, perfect? No. Do we start to have to go back to the well and redo things? Yes. Do we constantly go back to pre-mortem when we fork off and there's a whole nother initiative we're doing? Of course. So I think if that becomes part of your cultural practice, and really why I'm here kind of advocating for it, is that your world isn't set up in doing one pre-O or one pre-mortem and thinking that clarity happens. It's the idea that you constantly are doing it whenever you have something that a team or you as an individual are going to do that has impact on the company. And if you start with the failure and you do that across 20, 30, 40, 50 people, and that becomes cultural, imagine how much clarity starts to happen within the organization, right? And I think that's the difference of just saying we need clarity versus how do we get it, right? It's making it an action. And I think that's valuable.
Really cool. Got me thinking here. You've mentioned before the different approaches that startups have to go through here in Europe and in the US, for example, for the product in order to get capital. But there's also the point of storytelling in the fundraising process. We quite often see Austrian startups traveling to the Silicon Valley and nicely failing there because the storytelling is a completely different sort of culture there. How do you explain that? What kind of advice would you give there?
Yeah, I mean, so, and if you're isolated to how do you pitch and tell your story of what it is that you're doing, it's an interesting thing. Not everyone was built on this earth to pitch and be a great storyteller and be charismatic in the room and win over hearts and minds, right? But there is a common, I think, denominator. And I think one of the best things to just have is just focus, right? Answering the questions that will often come up. And again, what I think is the problem is that deck building, presentation building is trying to sound as successful as possible, right? And I'm going to go back to the well. It's do the founders actually interrogate their idea and say, what would make our company fail? And then do they build their presentation based on all the things that they're doing to prevent that from happening, right? And so can you beat Silicon Valley? Because all diligence and fundraising is going to be is trying to poke holes in everything, from you as a founder to the business, to the total addressable market, to your product team, to how you're going to do it, to whether it's market viability, right? To what the business model is, if it's scalable, all those types of things, the technology. So to me, re-engineering what you're thinking about when you build a deck to come at it from a place of like, am I answering the failure questions and am I showing up that way? To me, there's a great thing that came out, and I've always loved it, but it's this little Mad Lib, and maybe I can share it later, but it's a Mad Lib, and a Mad Lib is like you finish the word in the sentence, right? And it's a 60-second pitch for your startup, your business, whatever. but it's really great in the fact that it goes through a series of sentences where you fill in the question of like, this is what makes me unique. This is what our competitors are. This is why we have secret sauce to beat those competitors. This is our total addressable market. This is what I'm asking the money for. This is what we're going to spend it on, right? Like it goes through a whole series of things where it's like, just cut the BS and just get down to it from the mindset of like, I've already thought of the failures, right? So I think there's an advantage there if people start thinking about things that way rather than the glitz and glamour of what success could look like, right? People don't get enamored with that. They want to know if it'll work. And the only way to know it'll work is if you put the emphasis on what can make it fail.
You're also working, on the other hand, you're also working in your agency with big corporations. What are their hurdles? Maybe there are some common, failures that you see in your work, and you can easily put the finger on it.
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about failures is that they are diverse and they're all over the place, right? And we do listen to signals that come out where there's some common threads. I think the big one right now is really on the importance of culture and employee retention in big companies. I think that although we here in Silicon Valley understand this mental health equation and the fact that we're coming out of pandemic and that the world of work is changing, our proximity bias is going to be huge, those that come in the office versus those that work remote. But the employer brand is something that we're seeing as a massive theme, where in order to be the best company, you need the best talent, right? And you need to retain that talent, right? And you need to have the brand that you're putting on the outside match on the inside. And I think companies are starting to get really hip to this idea that you can't just have a veneer of the outside and be, subpar on the inside. And so we're seeing that is a lot of the work that we're doing is taking the external brand and making the internal brand more powerful, bigger, letting people live the brand. And that means that it's a lot of change. It's a lot of transformation, right? And I think that that's sort of the biggest theme that we're seeing is how do we build team? How do we build culture? How do we build employer brand? And then how do we get employees to live that brand? Because those are the biggest proponents of what your company's doing, right? At the end of the day. So, yeah.
Super. So from my side, thank you very much. That was really very interesting. Maybe you have any parting thoughts that you would like to share with us?
I love talking about this, so I hope people were listening and don't think I'm crazy. But at the end of the day, no, I just, this group is great. We're going to be in Vienna as soon as the pandemic sort of allows that to happen. I know Nina's over there, but check out prio.com. I would love to get some feedback is my last parting thought. We're in early days. We just launched the product this week. Very softly. We haven't even gone mass. So check it out and tell me what you think. You can reach me at trevor@butchershop.co or find me on LinkedIn.
Trevor, thank you so much. Such an amazing panel. And I loved how you actually said about failures, they're diverse. It's never boring. They're all over the place. It's amazing. It's so true. Thank you so much for explaining us the Clarity Project and how you help founders and entrepreneurs with that. Before we move to our next panel, Michaela, I actually have a question for you because, Austria is, innovation is at core of our, economy. So I would like to get a little bit more thoughts about that from you.
Yeah, Austria is not just the sound of music and Mozart, highly well-known classical music. Austria, for example, is also an industry nation. Little is known that Austria has the third highest industrial output per capita, or 28% of Austria's GDP is based on the industrial sector. Some 45% of all jobs in Austria are directly or indirectly connected, dependent on the industrial sector. The ICT sector, if we are talking about innovation, generates about 9% of the total value creation. Austria is also a top innovator in the field of R&D. 3.2% of Austria's GDP is spent on R&D in corporations and research institutions. We are only topped by Sweden here in Europe. And finally, Vienna is a top R&D city to be. The R&D quota is almost double the European Union's average. So that's the place to be.
Absolutely, Michaela, and home to many cool startups like we spoke before with Chris about Remove Background that recently got acquired by Canva. Bitpanda is our first official unicorn in Austria. They recently attracted money from Peter Thiel to grow in Europe. So very, very exciting ecosystem. I'm very excited for our next panel, and I would like to welcome Anna Pompa, Amit Garg, and Ute Stadlbauer to share their perspectives on culture of failure. Anna Pompa is the founder and CEO of findsisterhood, an anonymous social network for women that make posts untraceable and allow survivors to speak up without having to reveal their identity. Anna was a Techstar Los Angeles cohort in 2019. She is first winner at Tech and a Mass Challenge finalist in 2018. Amit Garg is co-founder and managing partner of Tau Ventures, a Palo Alto-based seed fund that invests in applied AI in digital health, enterprise, and automation. Amit has been in Silicon Valley for over 20 years. He co-founded Health IQ, a $450 million US company. He worked for Norwest Partners, as well as Samsung Next Ventures and Google. We also will be joined by Ute Stadlbauer from Vienna. She's the regional manager of the Americas, Spain, and Portugal at the Vienna Business Agency. Welcome, everyone.
Well, thank you, Mariana, for the introduction, and welcome, Anna and Amit. Hello, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thanks, Trevor and Chris, for your amazing insights that we just gained. Anna, are you on already?
Yes.
Yes. Hi. Anna, you have a very multicultural background. You're half Mexican, half Austrian. You've lived in 6 countries and 10 cities, and you're also a serial entrepreneur fostering female and diverse entrepreneurship. Anna, now comparing the US to Austria, what's the cultural difference and how do you benefit from both cultures?
Wow, that's a big question to start with. As I was listening to Trevor, I thought that it was really interesting when he was talking about what does success look like. And I think that's already where there's a very big difference, at least from what I've seen. I think in the US, it's a lot about dream big, like what's your vision and what's your mission? And you go into investor meetings with this whole like storytelling, and no dream is too big. Like there's going to be more investors that might reject you because your market size is not big enough versus the opposite. And I think in Austria, it's much more about numbers. Like you need to already have something to show for. And I just recently, with my new company, Founders Registry, we help diversify the founders landscape. So I practice a lot with founders, and we do pitch practice, we do their pitch decks. And it was so interesting, because just last week I had one founder in the US and one founder in Austria. And so I would like to use them as an example of how different they both did their pitch. And I was like, wait, you need to learn from each other. So the US founder was all about vision and mission, and this is my dream, and this is how we're going to disrupt this industry. And so they were all talking about the idea of what could potentially be. And then the Austrian founder, a woman, she was only talking about, this is my plan, this is the timeline, and with the very little funding that I'm trying to fundraise, this is exactly what I'm going to do with it, and this is when I'm going to do it. And I was just like, okay, what's your vision? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? And she's like, so first we're going to go to market, and then we're going to do social media. And I'm like, no. Like, why are you doing what you're doing? Like, what's the bigger dream behind it? And with the US founder, I was like, okay, but can I see any numbers? Like, have you achieved anything so far? Is there a product? Is there an MVP? Is there a prototype? Like, what's out there? And so I think that that's like 2 very big differences. And I'm not sure if that's correct. Like, I'm analyzing the markets right now. But one of the things that I do think is that in Austria, you have so much support when you start a company. Like, you don't have to worry about healthcare. You don't have to worry about childcare or after school or literally anything. Like there's just a safety net for most people in Austria. There's just a safety net. If you've been employed before, you can get unemployment. There are grants, there are funds, like there are so many things. So you actually have time to get your numbers right. Like there is the opportunity for you to get grant money from the government, to get support from your city, to have healthcare while you're trying to build out. So there's a different expectation when you're finally launching, like what have you achieved with all the support you're getting, versus the US, where it's like you're literally out on your own. You have no healthcare, there is no safety net. Hopefully you're gonna make it, because if not, you're probably gonna have to declare bankruptcy, and there's just no safety for founders. And so maybe that's why people go out and say, I'm just gonna go and get it, and they have to dream really big and fail really fast, because there's just no opportunity for them to play around with things, versus in Austria, where maybe the dream is much smaller to begin with, because there's so much safety that there's no reason to think that they're going to be the next Uber or the next Airbnb and all of the other unicorns that people love to compare themselves with. So that's how I see the biggest differences for myself.
So that's interesting. Risk aversity versus need for innovation. So Amit, I want to ask you, you recently co-founded Tau Ventures, a Silicon Valley AI-focused seed fund, and have been embracing investing way before the recent pandemic made it to mainstream. Tell us a little bit more about Tau Ventures, and what is your experience in investing in international or in teams with an international background? Can you see similar, do you have similar observations?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And first of all, just wanted to say, thank you for having me here. The whole team here put a great job, and hi to everybody listening. I think there's about 100+ people logged in. So to answer your question, Tau Ventures is a seed-focused fund in Palo Alto, heart of Silicon Valley. We started about 1.5 years ago. I've been a VC at 2 other funds before that. I've been an entrepreneur. The company I started has raised at this point 140 million. And before all of that, I started my career at Google, early days at Google. So I've seen different flavors of Silicon Valley. I've seen different flavors of tech. And I'm trying to bring all of this together here with Tau Ventures. We do primarily seed, although we are starting to do more beyond seed. We are looking into Series A's and B's and C's also opportunistically. And we focus on applied AI, artificial intelligence. So we think that AI is now at a point where you don't need 2 PhDs in order to build a company that has AI. You can take the stack of technology that's already built and apply it to solve a problem. I'll give a couple of examples here. Computer vision for colon cancer, right? The CEO, founder behind it didn't develop all of these things in order to use computer vision to detect colon cancer. He was able to take existing tools and put them together in a very meaningful way. We have another one that uses machine learning for drug discovery. We have another one that uses next generation sequencing for detecting infectious diseases, and so on and so on. And I focus more on the healthcare side. My partner does more on the enterprise side. And we were doing this before the pandemic. We have recognized that healthcare is extremely broken globally, but especially so here in the US. I'll share some metrics here that are staggering, especially I think to a lot of folks in Austria. We spend about 18% of our GDP in the US in healthcare. In most OECD countries, most developed countries, they spend about an average of 10%. And a country like Japan, which is probably at the edge of how good a healthcare system can be, they spend 4% and they have better outcomes. So in the US, we're spending about $1 trillion. That's what it turns out. $3.3 trillion, out of which 1 trillion is just in paperwork. And that by itself is bigger than most economies in the world. So there's something inherently broken with how the US healthcare system is managed. And we are trying to, technology is a big part of the solution. It's not the only solution. Policy is also a big part of that solution. But we are finding companies that can make processes more efficient, that can make drug discovery more efficient, that can make billing more efficient, that can make data exchanges more efficient. And invariably, the US is a nation of immigrants. We have so many different folks here from all parts of the world. I would say most of our companies have at least an immigrant at the helm, at the C-level, and they have teams perhaps that are located outside of the US. I actually have invested in an Austrian. It's a company called Rapid Deploy. The CEO, Reinhard Eckel, is Austrian. But we are blind to a person's nationality. We're investing in good entrepreneurs. Good entrepreneurs can come from anywhere. What we do look for is that entrepreneurs that are already here in the US and that understand the problem that they're trying to solve. So we are very friendly towards teams that are located outside, as in you have your R&D team in perhaps Vienna, or you have your BD team in Singapore, or you have your designer in London. All of that is good, but we need the CEO to be here.
Thank you. Thanks, Amit. Anna, when it comes to funding, I'm just referring to your latest project, the Founders Registry. You're trying to build an ecosystem for startup entrepreneurs and small business owners to demystify starting a company. Tell us a bit more about it. What's your main goal, or what are you trying to do with Founders Registry?
Yeah, so well, we're trying to support more businesses. How this came about is actually a conversation I had with one of our investors from my first company, and we had this like very long call. Well, for me, it was in the middle of the night because I'm currently in Europe. I'm usually based in LA, and right now I'm in Vienna. And so we were talking in the middle of the night and just like going over everything that has happened last year. And she was sharing with me, she's the CEO of one of the biggest media companies in the world. And so she was sharing with me how even for someone like her, it was devastating to just see how many small businesses just closed their doors in the pandemic, and how this crisis has really hit especially women. And from women, of course, we all know mothers. And I'm a mother myself. She's also a mom. She has 3 kids. I have 2. And so we were talking about how we could support small business owners and startup founders more, and how 44% of business owners start their businesses out of a crisis. So crisis mode is very common for people to share, to start their own companies. And so I started interviewing founders just to figure out, like, how can we help if we all want to come together right now? This is really tough on all of us. It doesn't even matter what kind of job you have. And one of the most common things that I heard from founders that were, or from women that were saying, I need to be self-employed. I need to start my own company because I need that kind of flexibility for my own work. Like, I don't know how to homeschool or how to be a caregiver and for elderly parents, for example, and how to have a job. And I have so much to give, and now I'm like forced out of the workforce. And that happened to millions of women. And when I started interviewing them, the most common thing, and you and I talked about this a few months ago, was that I said, why don't you just start? And they said, I just don't know where. And I feel like founders, like startup industry is such a, it looks so luxurious from the outside, right? We're all like, my introduction, Anna won this startup challenge and she was there and she was there. And like, it all sounds just so exciting and thrilling. But the reality is very different. Like, we work probably, I don't know, I would say 80 hours to 100 hours a week. That's what I worked the first 3 years of being a founder. I worked day and night. There were so many nights that I was just crying in the bathroom, just wondering, like, why did I do that? Like, what was I thinking? And then trying to figure out, how can we just let people know that founder, like being a founder is not just fun Silicon Valley and you're traveling a lot. Like, yes, that's how it looks like on social media, but the reality behind this, we have our why, and we're experts in what we're doing, and we're experts because we learned the hard way and we're putting in the work. And so that's how I started then Founders Registry, together with almost all of my investors from my previous company. And we all tried to like gather resources, like how can we get more people to be founders, and not just of startups, but also small businesses. Like, how can you start a small business? What does it take, and how can we help you? And bringing together that ecosystem, but really with the focus of just helping demystify this whole startup founder experience for people.
Oh, that's amazing insights. Going to startup culture and failure, Amit, Silicon Valley culture distinguishes itself by celebrating failure. How is the perception of by the international founders of this? What's your impression?
Yeah, so my personal background, I actually grew up in Brazil. I've been here in Silicon Valley now for 20 years, and my family comes from India. So I have half of my life outside of the US and a foot at all times outside of the US. So I see the differences, the cultural differences, the mindset differences on a daily basis. I, I, I wouldn't say celebrate failure. I would say accept failure. I think nobody obviously wants to fail. But in Silicon Valley, I think there's a much higher tolerance for it. And the mindset is that, look, if you failed, that's okay, as long as you learn from it, as long as you make different mistakes in the future, right? And if you look at the examples of many, many successful entrepreneurs, they are not people who succeeded at their first go. The media, especially the social media, celebrates the 20-something wonder kid who dropped out of college and created a big company. Let's call it Apple, let's call it Facebook, let's call it Google. Those do happen. Those are the exceptions to the rules. The vast majority of entrepreneurs actually, this is based on data, are people in their late 30s, early 40s. They usually have a family, they usually have a mortgage. There are people who have had 10, 15 years at least of work experience. They may have done a couple of startups before. In fact, I will quote even a founder I listened to a few years back. He was talking about his sixth company. And he was saying the other five helped me build the sixth one. By the way, the sixth one is worth now $6 billion. So it's, yes, if you do something over and over and you fail, then maybe it's something you are doing wrong, but you're fighting inherently against the odds when you're building a startup. So as long as you're learning, continuously making it better and better, I think that's, maybe it is to be celebrated. In other countries, I wouldn't put Austria in the same league as perhaps Brazil or India, because Austria is a more stable economy and it is a smaller market also. But depending on where you are, there's many factors that come into play, and there's understandably perhaps a lower tolerance for risk. If you, what Anna is talking about in terms of metrics here resonates a lot with me, because here in Silicon Valley, I almost joke that, hey, if you're making money, you're failing. You should be just growing. But if you go to New York, it's a different mindset. It's like, let's see if you're making revenues. And if you go to some other countries, it's about, okay, I need to absolutely make sure you're profitable, not only just making money, it's actually being profitable. So it's correlated with how much investment capital is available, how much mentorship is available, how big the market is, how big the economy is, right? Like stability of the economy. Like there's many different factors that come into play, and you can't reduce it to a single factor. If there's a single word, I would say it's a mindset. So anyways, I don't think Silicon Valley is the end all be all, by the way, as my last comment here. I think I cherish Silicon Valley very much. I've been here for 20 years and I think it's a wonderful place, but it's not the only way of doing business.
Thanks, Amit. So Anna, next question is for you. Now looking at diversity and female entrepreneurship in investment and founding, both in the US and Europe, what particularities do you identify, and do you see a trend towards a more diverse landscape, or maybe a new Silicon Valley somewhere? As Amit just said, it's not the end of the game.
Wow. So I first just wanted to say something to what Amit just said, a story that I thought was really interesting about exactly that difference. So we often talk now in Austria here about the US, right? But US West Coast versus East Coast, or even cities, are very, very different. So just as an example, when I started fundraising the very first time, I used a safe, and I had investors in New York. I mean, that's a few years ago, but they were like, what is a safe? Versus using a convertible note, and you go to San Francisco and people are like, you're using a convertible note? So that is really important to understand those differences. And my first investment I got when I was not even looking for an investment, because I didn't even have a company at that point. I had the product, but I never thought of the product as a company. And it was really interesting because I was talking to this one investor and I was just sharing all of these stories. And I think that's a mindset thing, because the investor then said to me, as far as I'm concerned, you've already had success. That's already success. The fact that you were able to touch so many lives, thousands of people across the world, and you don't even consider your product to be a company, for me, that's success. And I was like, well, but I've never made money with it. And he's like, the money is going to follow. I don't care. You have the growth and you have the impact. And for me, that's success. And his question to me was, if I would give you money right now, how do I know that you will not fail? And I said to him, well, I don't know that, right? Like, we don't know that. I might fail. It might not work out. But what I can promise you is that I will not ever give up trying to solve that problem. It might not be with this company, but it is something that is my personal calling, and I will never stop trying to figure out how to not fail in solving it. And he ended up giving me $500,000, and I ended up with a company 2 weeks later. And I was like, I guess I have a company now, let's go. And so it was all about just this one very intense conversation about failure, like what failure meant to me and what success meant to me. And it was really interesting. And so I think that you need to figure out what city works for you when we're talking about the US, what city works for you, for your style. Who are you as a founder? What kind of style do you have? What kind of investor is going to like the way that you pitch, the way that you solve problems? And so I think that's very important. To your question about diversity, I think when we just talk about gender, I think the US has as many problems as Austria has. We don't have enough female founders. Now, one of the things that I do think, though, is that I feel like in the US, we have a better excuse for why that is without blaming the VCs all the time. That's something that personally really bothers me, because one of the things that I just see as a woman and as a mom is it's much harder to start a company when you have a family and you're a mother. And I'm not saying, like, we know nowadays, thankfully, a lot of dads are very involved. So is the dad of my kids. But it's still that part alone is very, very different when you start a company. In Austria, I don't see it that way. I think that in Austria, you have, well, kindergarten is almost free or very cheap. Then you have school and it's free. So those things are just setting women up to be able to start their companies in a very different way than in the US. In the US, most female founders that I work with, I hate to say that, but they're just married to a man that has a lot of income, or they just come from generational wealth. So they just start at a very different starting point than other women. But when it comes to diversity, diversity as in the intersectionality of diversity, I feel like we all have so long ways to go. I barely know any Latinas like myself that have received venture capital. I teach entrepreneurship, and every time students, Hispanic students hear that I speak Spanish, that I'm Mexican, I have students that start tearing up, which actually is really sad because they usually don't see Mexican women that have companies that are funded, that have teams that start several companies. So I do think that there's so much more to go. And if we look at the numbers of like Black female founders, for example, how successful they are in bootstrapping their companies, probably because they have to, because they just know that receiving venture capital for them is going to be 10 times harder than for a white cis man. And so a lot of times they just have to put in the work, they have to bootstrap, they have to be crappy, they have to figure out ways to make it work because there's just no other option for them. And so I think that we have equally as much work to do in Austria as we have in the United States when it comes to diversifying the founders landscape. However, I do think that the setup in Austria is easier, or makes it easier for marginalized people to start their companies because there's the same system for everyone, right? Versus the US, where if you're born into a family where both parents went to an Ivy League college, chances of you getting funding if you ever start your company are immediately like 50 times higher versus if you're a Mexican born into a family where both parents are farm workers in California that make $4 an hour. How will you ever have access to VC money? How will you ever even meet an investor? How will you even learn how to talk to an investor when you finally get into the room with them? So there's just the starting points are so different for people in the United States than they are in Austria. That's at least my opinion as an immigrant in the US.
Hey, thanks, and good luck with Founders Registry. It's an amazing project. I would go back to failure and what your investor was talking to you and ask Amit, you as an investor, are there any mechanisms that help to build resilience and carry on in face of adversity? Anything that you yourself implement or you advise to your founders?
Well, I think you have actually answered the question here. Adversity is a very powerful way of building resilience. And a lot of things that Anna is saying do resonate with me too, because if you are an immigrant, it is harder for you anywhere, not just here in the US, anywhere in the world. I actually think that the US is one of the most welcoming countries for immigrants, arguably perhaps still the beacon of light here that the US proclaims to be. So, but yeah, I wouldn't say that we necessarily look for this in somebody's biography, but we do look for indications of resilience in how they run their business. For instance, if I know that a founder, I'll give an example. Actually, I think that will illustrate this best. I had a founder that I backed who told me that 3 years prior to us working together, they had run out of money, and the entire team stuck together. They decided to work for free until they actually got an investment, and they were willing to believe in it and put 3 months without making any money until they actually succeeded in landing an investment, and then the company took off. And by the time they came to me, they were already quite successful in revenues. But that told to me that, look, it wasn't just the founder who had resilience, it built in the collective, in the team itself. And that's what we look for. It's a founder or founders can be the guidepost for a culture, but we look for a culture, for a team that together can overcome the obstacles. There's a common saying that 90% of startups fail. Depending on how you look at it, that is actually true. So how do you become that 10%? And I think the way you become a 10% is by believing perhaps inordinately in what you're doing. Being an entrepreneur in many ways is holding two contradictory ideas in your head. It's having the utter overconfidence, perhaps, that I can succeed, and also the utter humility of knowing that the odds are against me. And how do I combine those two paradoxical ideas in my head and still keep marching forward? So that is something that can't be quantified easily. In our diligence process, we just to give some numbers here, we look at about 2,000 companies a year. We will look at the decks for most of them and probably take 10% of those as meetings. So 200 meetings, a second meeting with maybe about 100, a third meeting with maybe about 50 of them. And by the time that we're getting into a fourth meeting, we're down to maybe 20, 25 companies where we put in 50 to 100 hours worth of work in creating deal memos and understanding a lot of things about them. And it's this dialogue. A diligence is more a dialogue than anything else. We understand the entrepreneurs, their motivations, how they're thinking about things, how well they would work with us. And a lot of these aspects around how do you tolerate failure, how do you deal with adversity, how do you build resilience, they all come into play. So we try to read the tea leaves when we're doing that.
Well, I think that's great last words for our panel. Thanks so much for the insights that we're gaining. And I think we're going to go on to a Q&A session.
Thank you, Amit and Anna. So many cool things I learned from you today. Thanks for sharing your perspectives. Ute, before we move to the next, to the Q&A, I'm just super curious to get your perspective on one thing that City of Vienna and Vienna Business Agency are doing, because you guys are very supportive for basically founders of startups. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, yes. Well, we are very supportive to founders of startups, but also existing companies, especially for startups. We have a few programs running. One of them is the Founders Lab. And within the Founders Lab, we try to stress the ideas and concepts of the startups and also try to force them to iterate them. Just kind of support them building up a sustainable and mindful business. So that's one thing that we do. We're also engaged in many projects going on in the city. There is the Fuck Up Nights that we cooperate with. It's an event series where startups and companies present their biggest failures, what they learned out of it, and how they're going to proceed. And then to pick up what Chris earlier said, that it's a question of mindset and innovation has to be fostered with the very young. We have a few programs for primary school kids that are called Idea Tech, and where the kids are setting in kind of innovative future entrepreneurial mindset, and we try to foster that. Also to make R&D, startups, technology accessible to young kids, especially young girls. So it's a lot going on. We have many different initiatives here in the city.
Well, thank you, Ute, for telling us all of this. And it's super important to start early. Like the book from Carol Dweck, she's describing this growth versus fixed mindset. And I think at some point it's just simply too late. So amazing what you guys are doing in Vienna. I would like to open now for Q&A. So please, everyone, post your questions in the chat and to our speakers. All right. Here we go. Oh, we have a question from Dudu.
I think it's for me.
Okay, it's dealing with 2,000 plus pitch decks. Does Stadlbauer Ventures has any criteria in place to reduce these biases?
So, Dudu, I'm not sure what you mean by biases here, but I think what you're saying is how to filter most effectively. So yes, a lot of companies we get are simply very easy for us to say they're not a fit for us. They may be very good businesses and they may be very good fits for others. They might be outside of US and Canada, which is our current focus, right? Like we're not investing in, I get a lot of deals from Brazil and India, given my ties to those two countries. And I tell them, look, I'm just not investing, but here's, if I know the person, I'll tell them, here's somebody else who could be interesting. They might be at a different stage. They might be looking for a Series D or a Series C, or they might be looking for a lead investor. And I'm not big enough to lead a Series A or B yet. They might not be using AI in the way that we look for. They might be an e-commerce play or a gaming play. So we are a specialized fund. And in fact, I encourage every entrepreneur to spend 5 minutes going to somebody's website, looking up what kinds of companies they invest in, what their investment thesis is. It will save everybody time. It will save the entrepreneur a lot of time, because it takes energy to send an email out and have an expectation of a response, right? So we filter out many of these companies very quickly. I like to say that within 5 minutes I can tell whether from a deck whether it's a fit for us or not. The more tricky cases are those companies where it could be a fit, but I'm not quite sure. And in that case, I make a judgment whether it's actually worth for us to follow up or not. And in that case, we look for who is the team, what's the market, what's the technology, what's the product, what's the competitive landscape, how the company came to us, is the round almost closing, is the round just kicked off, right? I look at all these different dynamics to come up with, within hopefully 5 minutes, a judgment of, okay, yes, we should do a meeting here to understand this better. And I encourage, once again, all entrepreneurs to leverage, let me use this, validation as effectively as possible. One way of doing the validation is you already know the VC in some capacity. Yes, then feel free to reach out directly. But another validation is you've worked with somebody who knows the VC very well, then reach out through them. Because for better or for worse, it's so many deals hitting any one VC. If it is a filter off the social validation, it does help. It does help a lot. Oh, I see. So Dudu just sent out a clarification, and let me just answer that. We might be biased towards profiles of founders, strong studies that confirm that there's a bias in the place in the VC world towards certain groups, et cetera, et cetera. How aware are VCs of their own biases? No, great point. definitely there are biases, and you're right, there are studies. I think I would like to say that increasingly there's an awareness of it, and people are trying to be consciously aware and corrected for it. In my previous VC fund, we were actually tracking statistics. We were looking at our funnel and seeing, okay, what are the backgrounds of the founders that we are seeing? At Tau Ventures, I dare say that, look, I try to be as blind as I can to who a person is, at least what a person looks like, and I'm looking at the content of their character and their capacity and their capability. Right, easier said than done, for sure. I don't know. I don't think the VC industry is there yet. I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I have seen an improvement for sure in the just even in the couple of years, in the last couple of years, but overall in these last 20 years, I've certainly seen an improvement.
Well, that's good news to everyone here. We have a question from Ivan. The question is for Chris. What was the biggest failure in your career and how did you deal with that?
Well, there's been several, there's been many. I think the biggest personal failure probably was just a couple of years ago when I co-founded a startup company, an AI company, brought it through Y Combinator, and had raised a bunch of money. And after going through that whole process, came to the realization that the dynamic between the three co-founders just wasn't really working. And there was a lot of interpersonal dynamics that we tried hard to overcome, but there was just some fundamental, I think, disagreements and tensions that we were unable to resolve. And ultimately, after going through a pretty challenging set of conversations, it was decided that I would leave and depart. And so that was personally very, very difficult. Big part of that, like when you get into a startup and you raise money for it, at least for me, my sense is that it's going to take 5 to 7 years, if not longer, to realize the full, vision. So it's a commitment. I mean, it's a big deal. And I was very confident going into the process that it would work out. And so when it didn't, I found myself in a pretty deep hole personally. I had put a lot of, I think, personal capital and my own identity into this thing that I was working on. And it was something that I was working on day in and day out very publicly. And it took probably a year for me to, I don't even know, say I'd recovered, but I kind of just I ended up going and leaving Silicon Valley for another year on a kind of walkabout to kind of find myself and recenter myself. So, in that case, that was a real kind of skyrocket up and then complete crash into the field. My airplane blew up and I forgot to pack a parachute. So that was challenging. That was hard. That was probably my biggest one. And I feel like just 2 years later, I'm finally in a place where I'm kind of calm and recentered.
Well, thank you for sharing this with us. I mean, entrepreneurship way, it's a roller coaster, right? It's up and down non-stop.
Yeah, it's like you haven't built out the end of the roller coaster, then there's going to be a disaster. So, you do have to be very aware of runway and things like that.
Well, it has to also to take some guts to understand when it's not working anymore and just to stop and move to something else. Because what I see is some founders are so in love with their product, they're just stuck in that. It doesn't matter if users feedback is not good. They're just, just going with that. So it's good to have
so
this.
True.
Yeah.
It's good to be humbled every now and then. Yeah.
So true. Our next question is, do you have an examples to share of how a failure became a success to all of you guys speakers here? Any stories you can share?
Sure. First of all, I think we have to define what the failure is and what a success is, because there's different definitions for it, right? If you're looking strictly monetarily, which is one way of looking at it, I'll give this as an example that my partner did. He had invested in a company in his previous life that was doing a partnership was building a mapping product, and then Google entered in the space, and then Google sucked the oxygen out of the market, really, and the company started basically declining. And he helped them, the company, sell themselves to Uber, and then Uber, obviously, as a private company, kept growing and growing and growing. And then when Uber ended up exiting, that failure initially ended up becoming a huge success. So I'll give credit here to my partner that he realized what was going on. He figured out a lifeboat, and he was able to get that team into that lifeboat and help them succeed within this lifeboat, and then ended up being a hugely money-making exit for everyone involved, investors included. So that's one way of taking a success and making it to a failure. I've seen other examples like this in my career, in my portfolio. But I think if you're looking at success, transforming failure into success, there's other ways of looking at this problem. Like maybe you were trying a product and the product wasn't working, and then you tried a few things, and then eventually what you thought wasn't working ends up getting traction somewhere else and taking off from there. And I'll give the example of Twitter here. Twitter was a spin out from a different company that nobody knows today. It was actually an experiment. It was a podcast company that experimented with, oh, let's do these 140 character messages. And they saw it was a fun experiment, and they saw, oh, okay, maybe this has some potential. So let's just let these people go. There's a great book about this called Hatching Twitter. You should read about it. The overall company failed massively, but because of this experiment, they now have a company that's worth $50 billion, right? So I think the world ends up taking you in unexpected directions from both of these two stories here. I'll pass it to Anna and Chris. I'm sure they'll have a lot more to add.
Go ahead.
You go ahead, Chris.
It's a weird question, I guess, because again, like it comes from this perspective that the failure is sort of finite, as opposed to, again, like a process. I don't know. I liked Amit's story about being able to sort of exit into something that then became like much bigger. It's sort of like you have your leftovers, and then you kind of make tacos the next day or something like with those leftovers. Like it's sort of just a way of recombining stuff and being more experimentational. Is that a word? That's not a word, but regardless,
Experimentalists.
Sure. I mean, I guess like I feel like the funny thing is that so many of the things that I've done are failures until they're not. I mean, like even like the story of the hashtag, it was pretty much a failure for like 5 years, and it was sort of me behaving in this esoteric, bizarre, way, and then eventually the thing that I saw that was probably going to happen, happened, but much, much later than anybody would have really thought, right? I mean, it's been 15 years since I proposed the hashtag, and people are still discovering it for the first time. And it's as though it's kind of like been there forever. And it feels like it's one of those things where the likelihood of it succeeding was so unlikely. I mean, social media itself was thought that it wasn't going to work. So there was sort of like a cascade of things that had to sort of go right in lots of different ways. I mean, in some ways, if it weren't for the iPhone, like maybe the hashtag would never actually have taken off. So you can't quite unpack individual success without looking at the broader context and the pressures that gave rise to the thing happening. Like, for example, the iPhone was introduced in 2007 in January. And then I wrote the proposal for the hashtag in August of that year. If I had written the proposal for the hashtag a year later, when the iPhone was more successful and we weren't still using feature phones that had hardware-based buttons and we were using software-based keyboards, then the hashtag may not have actually solved the problem for people. But because we were still using SMS and text messaging and the iPhone wasn't popularized yet, there was a window where that weird behavior could actually work. So you have to like put all these things into that context, which is why I guess for me, I don't look at those successes as being, I don't take them like as too representative of me personally. It is, whether it's about luck or about context or just sort of responding to the moment. And in my case, a lot of people, one of the questions that people asked me previously was like, well, why didn't you patent this? Why? You could have made a bunch of money off the hashtag or whatever. And it was like, well, because if I'd inhibited the adoption or use of this behavior and required everyone to get permission from me, then they probably wouldn't have used it, and then it wouldn't have succeeded. And so how many other things were better than the hashtag, but that were restricted in some way through intellectual property rights, and then never took off and never became popular? So you really have to balance, I think, what you're trying to achieve with the mechanisms and means by which you pursue it.
And would you like to share your story?
I just wanted to share about teams. So I think for me, one of the biggest learning lessons, I wouldn't call it failure, but it was the person that I thought would be my first co-founder, and then going through a really rough time, because we were part of Mass Challenge. It was at the very beginning. So that's an accelerator program in Boston. And we were located in Los Angeles. So I had to fly, well, I wanted to fly back and forth to not see my kids for so long, twice a week. So twice a week, LA, Boston. It was a complete nightmare. It was really, really stressful. I had no idea what I was doing. Like, looking back, I had no business being a founder, or I had no business having raised outside funding. It was just a little bit overwhelming, a little bit too fast, all of it. And the person that I worked with, that I spent a lot of money from our first round invested in, that person just turned out to be a complete mismatch. And they just thought, they were twice as old than me. It was a white man, not that it matters, but I do feel like that there was a big part of ego here. And so he had this amazing career, and I had complete imposter syndrome. So I felt like, you know, who am I to be employing someone like that? And he was this extremely successful director of a public company. And I admired him so much, and he has been one of my advisors before. And then he all of a sudden became a team member of mine. And one of the things that I did not take into account, I thought, well, I know him. I know that we know each other. We have a history, we have personal history. He understands my product. He understands my why, and all of these things. But the biggest thing that I was missing, that is now the only thing I look at, is that we were a mismatch when it came to values. So for the values is something that, as a startup, you will never be able to have, like, if you have mismatched values, it's never going to work out. I tried to throw money at the problem, right? I was like, okay, it makes sense that he should be paid 4 times more than me as the CEO and founder of the company, because he's like twice my age and he has a PhD and he's like this super successful person. So it just makes sense to waste all of my pre-seed money on keeping him with the company. And it was a mix of inexperience, of imposter syndrome, and probably also because we knew each other for so long that I just felt like I couldn't say no to it. And now I know that it's not even about the money. It's the fact that the money was his motivation to show up to work, and that he was not going to stick around if things got hard, because he was in it for the money, and that's it. And so that mismatch of values for me was so important. And I'm actually grateful that it happened so early on in my entrepreneurial career, because it really taught me that from there on, I only even interviewed only candidates that I knew understood my value system and were going to be there for better or for worse. Because if that's not your team, then I think it's going to be really, really hard to succeed as a startup. And not even financially. Like, it could be hard because there's a pandemic, or it could be hard because it's just super stressful, right? There are so many things that can go wrong. And so if you have someone in it that is there because of the values that they have that align with your values, the likelihood of succeeding and just sticking it out together is going to be so much higher than someone who is there because they hope it's going to be the next unicorn and they're just going to be wealthy overnight, basically, without having to do the work.
Yeah. Can I add one? I'll be really quick. Can I add one thing? Okay. I think the pandemic is like the perfect grounds to talk about failure. Yeah. And I don't think any of us were expecting it. If you were, talk to me. I'd love to know how you thought of that. But for our business around, like, we talked about what would make us fail years ago. And one of the things that made it on that list was that there's an outside economic force, right, that shuts business down around the world. Interesting. Also, another one that was on that list was that San Francisco goes into lockdown for some reason, and we can't move around the world to do business. That was one of the reasons on our list. I have the picture that I shared with the office from years ago. When we talked about the failures of our business, it was really interesting that when we designed our business during those last 3 years, a lot of the moves we made were about diversifying how we work, digitization, remote workforce, right? Looking at talent differently, putting multiple horizons out, acquiring, like during the pandemic, to beat failure, we acquired a company in Mexico, right? We opened an office in Europe, all during the pandemic. We started a venture arm of our company called Imagine Buy. Like we did all of these things during a pandemic because we had done the work to talk about the unpopular things of what would hurt our business. So to us, the pandemic was the best year of our company's life. For individuals, tough. But as a leader and a CEO, I also changed my behaviors. You know, I knew that our culture would be hurt by this. So I wrote an email every single night. I've done 420 of them since the pandemic, started. And it's that kind of thing that if we didn't know what would make us fail, we couldn't have responded so quickly to how we were going to kind of thrive in this environment, right? And a lot of people were sort of left like a deer in the headlights. Like, what do we do? So the failure mindset, I think, comes back when you look at your business, so that if something happens that's out of your control, you kind of already thought about it, right? And isn't that kind of cool? So anyway, that's just what I thought I'd offer about like a big failure in the pandemic and how that was beaten, I guess. I don't know.
Well, this is a very good insight, Trevor. There is another question for you. We have from Svarup saying that finding startups and running own business is associated with the financial risks. How to set up a company keeping this in mind and minimize financial risks?
I guess let me take a crack at it, given that I represent the vulture capitalists here. So there's multiple things that are very sensible to do. Obviously, make sure that you, as founders, own enough shares, enough in the company. A good framework is you should expect 20 to 30% dilution in your first institutional round. Let's call it seed. Reasonably similar when you raise a Series A, and then it starts going down. So maybe 20%, 15% in the Series B, and then if you do the Series C, D, and E, then it's 10, 15%. There's reasons for why this is not somewhere written in iron. It's a norm. It's a market norm. There's reasons why these norms exist. We can talk about it another time. But if you do the math here, if it's you and another co-founder, chances are you will own just about 50% of the company by the Series B. And very likely at that point, you will have a board of 5 people. Very likely 5 is a very good number. 7 is a stretch, 3 is too little. 5, you have 2 representing the investors, 2 representing the founders. I'm sorry, I should say 2 representing the company and 1 representing an independent, right? So it becomes a very balanced board. You can disassociate economic interest from control. So you can still say, hey, look, investors, I will still give you 50% of the company, but I'm not giving you 50% of the control. That is by setting up different classes of shares. One way that people do these, not as common, is by setting up founder shares. It's a controversial topic. I actually had founder shares in my own startup. I'm now also an investor. Depending on when you talk to me, I'll say that's a good thing or a bad thing. So you should at least consider founder shares, but be aware that VCs are not going to like the founder shares very much. Once again, because they will have less control, right? But I think the most important thing for you is to not look at this as a zero-sum game. I'm speaking as somebody who has been on both sides. If you are looking at a zero-sum game with someone, that is not the right investor to be working with. You should be looking at them as a partner. You should be looking at them as somebody who will be in the trenches with you at the early stage, who will be helping you, who'll be helping you with strategy, with governance, with partnerships, with hiring. They are a co-owner with you. And you are the captain, they're the first mate. You are running the ship, they're there to do anything it takes for you to succeed, including cleaning the floors, which I have done. So if that's not the equation you're developing, then it's not a good partnership for you. So I'll leave that, because I believe fundamentally that venture capital is a very powerful way of making a very big impact into the world. You look at the biggest companies in NASDAQ, about 50% of the market cap in the US was started by 1% of the capital in the US, which is venture capital, right? Microsoft, Apple, Google, all of these were venture funded. So I'll stop here now.
Trevor, would you like to add something here?
No, I mean, I think that's it's the art and science part, right, Amit? Like, founders oftentimes aren't fluid in this, and maybe actually I can reframe a question to Amit, because you're so good at talking about this, is what can founders do to educate themselves and get better prepared to handle a lot of these raises and rounds, which, you know, I've done probably 36 of these things. They're complicated. They read all over the place. You don't know what really you have, and how do you find your allies when you're bootstrapped and you don't have money? Like, what's the best way to kind of like advise your founders to come to the table with just a little bit of understanding of these things?
Sure. So Trevor, I think you're absolutely right. There is an asymmetry of knowledge. As a VC, I see thousands of companies, thousands of term sheets, and a founder will see maybe a handful in building a company, right? So totally understand that asymmetry. Not all founders, by the way, have that asymmetry. I'm starting to see more and more founders, especially serial entrepreneurs, who have my level of knowledge, honestly, which is very refreshing, because then we go right away into like the substance rather than trying to figure things out. I encourage every founder to have a board of advisors around them. I'm not talking about a board of directors. I'm talking about a board of advisors. I have a board of advisors for my life, people that I reach out to who will give me advice on my life. I think you should also have a board of advisors for your company. These are people who you should give shares out to. And a good way of thinking about it is give them 0.25% of the company. If that 0.25% of the company helps you raise 2 times more money, it was a worthy investment, right? Or two times easier, or 2 times easier negotiations, right? So the board of advisors that you have could be somebody who helps you with BD, could be somebody who helps you with tech, could be somebody who helps you with fundraising, could be somebody who has been a VC and is retired, could be an angel investor who will really, oftentimes is an angel investor. And I encourage founders to have open conversations with VCs. The diligence process is a two-way conversation. If the VC is deciding whether to invest in you, you should be deciding if this VC is somebody you want to have invested in you. So I like when founders ask me tough questions. And I like when founders ask me, I don't quite understand that, explain to me. If the VC is not explaining it to you in the way that you would like, I know that Silicon Valley perhaps has the luxury because there's so many VCs here. But if you are in an ecosystem that's dense, don't work with that VC. Go work with another VC, right? So I think it's a continuous process that's constantly evolving. And Trevor, I make myself available here to you. If there's things that you want, shoot me a note. I like learning. I can't do that for everyone, honestly, but I try my best as much as I can. I put blogs out, and a lot of VCs do that too.
This is totally Silicon Valley. Things happen right now, right in the moment. Very good. I just realized we are running out of time. I wish we would have more time for this amazing panel, but I would like to thank Chris, Amit, Anna, and Trevor for joining us today and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you, Ute. Thank you, Michaela, ABA, Austrian Business Agency, and Vienna Business Agency for organizing this panel. And tthank you, Manuel, for making sure that everything ran smooth. I announced the end of this panel. Wishing you all staying positive, testing negative, and hope next year we meet at Vienna Up in person in Vienna.
Thanks so much. This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was
Bye-bye.
actually amazing. I had the real fun being on a panel.
Yeah, me too. It was great. Thank you.
I've learned a lot. Thank you very much, guys.